Ghost Angel Bashinishi. She had saved 43 lives on a mountain that doesn't exist on any map, in a country the Pentagon never officially entered, using supplies meant for a unit that was never supposed to be there. She came home with shrapnel scars across her left forearm, a classified commendation locked in a vault at Fort Bragg, and a nursing license she earned in 18 months flat. Tonight, in a bar called Decker's in a mid-sized Colorado city, a Marine commander with 6 months in country and a brand new set of silver bars just laughed at her drink order. He thought she was a tired ER nurse. He thought the worst thing about tonight was going to be the tab. He was wrong about both. If this story already has you hooked, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, subscribe, and follow along because you do not want to miss what happens next. The bar was called Decker's, and it had been a Marine hangout for long enough that the stools had permanent impressions in them. Ashford, Colorado wasn't a big city. It was the kind of place where a military base and a regional hospital were the two largest employers, and everyone knew someone connected to at least one of them. On a Friday night in October, Decker's filled up early. There were uniforms at every table, pitchers going warm, and a flat screen above the bar showing a game nobody was really watching. Olivia Carter came in just after 8. She was still in her scrubs. She hadn't bothered changing because she hadn't planned on staying. She just wanted one beer and maybe 20 minutes of something that wasn't a patient crashing or a charge nurse breathing down her neck about documentation. 11 hours in the ER at Riverside Veterans Medical Center would do that to you. She'd had 2 codes before noon, a GSW that came in screaming and left unconscious, and a late afternoon chest trauma that nobody thought was going to survive until she got her hands on him. He did survive. He wouldn't know her name by Monday. She took a seat at the far end of the bar, away from the cluster of Marines at the center tables. She knew most of them by general type, if not by name. She'd patched enough of them up over the past 3 years to recognize the posture, the way they sat like they were always ready to stand. The group tonight was louder than usual, which meant a celebration of some kind. She flagged down the bartender, a heavy-set guy named Terrence, who always poured 2 fingers short. The usual? Amber draft, whatever's coldest. He nodded and moved off. Olivia pulled out her phone and stared at it without really seeing it. She was still running the chest trauma in her head, the approach, the decision she'd made in the 3rd minute when his pressure started dropping, the thing she'd done that wasn't in the nursing protocol, but had kept him alive anyway. She did that after hard cases. She couldn't not do it. You look like someone who had a rough shift. She looked up. A man had settled onto the stool next to hers, early 30s, clean cut, wearing a dress uniform with freshly pinned captain's bars. He had the look of someone who'd just gotten good news and wanted everyone in the room to share it. That obvious? She said. The scrubs are kind of a tell. He extended a hand. Doyle. Marcus Doyle. Just got my captain's bars today. Olivia. She shook it briefly. Congratulations. You're from Riverside, the Veterans Hospital? ER. He nodded, impressed in a surface-level way. Tough work. My guys end up there sometimes. He glanced at her scrubs again, at the dried coffee stain on her sleeve she hadn't noticed until now. So what's a nurse do to unwind besides drink alone at Decker's? There wasn't much malice in it. That was almost the worst part. He wasn't trying to be condescending. He just was, naturally, without effort. Same things anyone does, she said, and turned back to her phone. But Doyle was celebratory and a little drunk, and the kind of man who misread disinterest as shyness. He leaned an elbow on the bar. You know, we've got a corpsman in my unit who swears ER nurses are the toughest people in any hospital, says they see everything. He's not wrong. But he also said they're not the same as battlefield medics. Doyle smiled. No offense, just different skill set. Olivia took a long pull of her beer when Terrence set it down. Sure. My unit's got guys who've done 3, 4 deployments. Real trauma. The kind of stuff nurses here don't see. He was still smiling, still meaning nothing by it, which meant everything. You know what I mean. I do, she said, and she did, just not in the way he meant. One of Doyle's friends, another officer, taller, already on what looked like his 3rd drink, leaned over from the next stool. Doyle, you're bothering the lady. I'm not bothering her. We're having a conversation. He looked back at Olivia. We are having a conversation, right? You're having it, she said. I'm listening. Someone at the table behind them laughed at something unrelated. The TV cut to a commercial. Terrence set down a second round for the group without being asked. Here's something, Doyle said, still in that loose, celebratory mode. My unit does this thing at parties. Everyone gives their call sign. The ones who've been out in the field. He swept a hand toward his table. Doyle's a tough one to codename, so they gave me Stryker back in Kandahar. Real creative. He said it with self-deprecating humor, which she almost respected. You ever get a call sign? In nursing school or whatever? She looked at him. Just for a second, she looked at him straight on, the way she almost never looked at people anymore. Ghost Angel, she said. The humor drained out of Doyle's face. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. He set his drink down. His friend, who'd been turning back toward the table, stopped mid-turn. Across the room, one of the older men, a big guy in civilian clothes with a retired NCO's bearing, gray at the temples, seated alone near the pool tables, went very still. I'm sorry, Doyle said. What did you say? You asked for a call sign, Olivia said. That's mine. She picked up her beer and finished half of it. She was just tired. She hadn't meant anything by saying it. She'd spent the last 3 years not saying it, and tonight she'd said it because she was tired and he was condescending, and she was 31 years old, and there was no reason on earth she needed to justify herself to a newly minted captain who'd never seen her work. But Marcus Doyle wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at her with an expression she recognized, the specific look of a person who has just tripped over something in the dark and isn't sure yet if they're hurt. Ghost Angel was, he stopped. That's a classified designation. That's not a call sign you can just... Where did you hear that? I didn't hear it anywhere. His friend had fully turned back. At the table, the conversation had dropped. The retired NCO near the pool tables stood up. Olivia set her glass down and picked up her phone. Enjoy your promotion, Captain. Wait. Doyle put a hand on her arm. Not hard, not aggressive, just the reflex of someone who didn't understand what was happening and needed it to stop. She looked at his hand. He took it back. I'm sorry, I just need to understand. No, you don't. She pulled a 10 from her pocket and set it on the bar. Terrence, keep the change. She was halfway to the door when the retired NCO cut across the room and stopped in front of her. He was probably 60, with a face that had logged serious weather, and he wasn't drunk. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Ma'am, he said quietly, I need to ask you something. She waited. Kurdistan Province, Operation Hollow Reach, 2017. His voice was barely above the noise level of the bar. Were you there? The noise of the bar seemed to fold back from around them. Olivia looked at him steadily. I don't know what you're talking about. No, he said. You wouldn't. He stepped aside. Have a good night. She walked out. The October cold hit her in the face, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, keys in hand, not moving. Behind her, through the door, she could hear the bar noise start again. A slow, uncertain restart, like a crowd after a power outage. She should go home. She had a 7 a.m. start. She walked to her car. Across town, in a house with the blinds drawn on a residential street 2 miles from Riverside Veterans Medical Center, a man named Walt Greer sat at a kitchen table with a glass of water he hadn't touched. He was 58, gray-haired, and had the hands of someone who'd once done physical work. He'd been a master sergeant before a knee took him out, and for the last decade he'd run a veterans support nonprofit out of a converted office space on the city's east side. He knew most of the regulars at Decker's. He knew most of the staff at Riverside. He knew Olivia Carter by name and by face, the way you knew anyone who was quietly good at their job in a small enough city. He picked up his phone at 9:07 p.m. He called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. It rang twice. This is Greer, he said. I need to speak to someone in the office of the Surgeon General. It's not urgent. He paused. Actually, it is. I think I just found someone who's been off the grid for a while. Ghost Angel. He listened. Yeah, I'll hold. He held for 6 minutes. When the line transferred, he said the name again, and this time the voice on the other end said something that made him close his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Ashford, Colorado. She's working ER at Riverside Veterans. Has been for about 3 years." Another pause. "I know. I don't think she was hiding. I think she was just done." He listened again. "I'll make sure she doesn't go anywhere. Just, whoever you send, tell them not to make it a scene. She doesn't like scenes." He hung up and sat with his water for a long time. Olivia's apartment was a second-floor unit in a building that was fine, and nothing more than fine. She'd lived there since moving to Ashford and had never fully unpacked, not because she was planning to leave, but because the boxes didn't bother her and unpacking felt like a statement she wasn't ready to make. She had a good couch, a coffee maker that worked, and a wall in the second bedroom that she used as a combination office and storage space. On that wall, behind a filing cabinet, there was a single photograph she'd taken down 3 years ago and never put back up. She didn't need to look at it to remember what was in it. She heated up leftover rice and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, watching the window above the sink. The city wasn't loud this far from the base. She could hear wind sometimes, and once in a while a dog. She was thinking about the chest trauma again, not the decision this time, but the moment just before, when she'd looked at the man on the table and seen not a patient but a problem that needed solving. She'd learned to do that early on. The problem solving was the part you could do. The rest of it, the fear, the weight of it, the way she'd had to actively not think about whether this man had a wife, kids, a name beyond the chart number, that was the part you stored somewhere else. She was very good at storage. Her phone buzzed at 11:20. Unknown number. Ashford area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. She didn't. Olivia Carter. She said her name because she'd gotten out of the habit of saying hello first. "Ms. Carter, my name is Colonel Renata Voss. I'm calling from the office of the Army Surgeon General." The voice was professional, unhurried, and careful in the specific way that people were careful when they were delivering news they expected to be unwelcome. "I apologize for the hour. Do you have a few minutes?" Olivia set down her fork. "How did you get this number?" "We have your records on file." A pause. "I imagine you know why I'm calling." "I don't, actually." "I think you do, Ms. Carter." She leaned back against the counter. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. "What I know is that I got off a long shift, went to get a drink, and now I'm getting a call at 11:20 from someone who says she's a colonel. I don't know anything else." "Your service record was flagged tonight. We've been," a slight hesitation, "looking for you. Not aggressively, but there's been an effort to locate former members of certain specialized units, and your name has come up several times in the last 2 years." "I left," Olivia said. "Honorable discharge. Everything filed correctly." "Yes, your discharge was clean. This isn't about any kind of disciplinary matter." The colonel's voice shifted very slightly. Not warmer, but more direct. "General Maddox wants to speak with you, in person." The name landed in the room differently than other names would have. Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Victor Maddox." "Yes. He's 4-star now." "Since 2021. She looked at the wall across from her. Not the one with the filing cabinet, but the one with nothing on it. "When?" "He's in Colorado Springs. He's willing to drive to Ashford." Another pause. "He said to tell you," and I'm quoting, "tell her I'm not asking her to come back. I just want to talk." He thought that might matter. It did matter. That was the problem with Victor Maddox. He always knew which things mattered. "Tomorrow," she said. "Not at the hospital. There's a diner on Crane Street called Halverson's. He can meet me there at 8. "I'll let him know." "Colonel." She stopped the woman before she could hang up. "Whatever Walt Greer told you tonight, tell him I said thank you, and that I'm going to make him buy me a beer." A beat of silence. "I'll pass that along." She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment, and then she finished her rice, washed the bowl, and went to the second bedroom. She moved the filing cabinet 6 inches to the left. She looked at the photograph she hadn't looked at in 3 years. 7 people in full field gear. Mountain terrain behind them, snow on the ridgeline. Nobody was smiling. That wasn't the kind of photo you smiled in. She was second from the left, younger by about a decade, looking at something off-frame with an expression that she no longer entirely recognized as her own. Two of the people in the photo were dead. One was in a VA hospital in Phoenix. The rest she'd lost track of, or deliberately not tracked. She put the filing cabinet back. She went to bed and didn't sleep well. Halverson's Diner opened at 6 and was usually half full by 7. By 8 on a Saturday morning, it was crowded enough to be private in the way that only really busy places were private. Too much noise for anyone to track a specific conversation. Olivia arrived at 7:50 and took a corner booth that faced the door. She ordered coffee and looked at the menu she'd had memorized for 2 years. Victor Maddox came in at 8:02, alone. She'd expected an aide, maybe two. But he walked in wearing civilian clothes, plain coat, no visible insignia, and he scanned the room the same way she always scanned rooms. And when he saw her, he didn't do anything as theatrical as smile. He just walked over and sat down. He'd aged, not badly, but honestly. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd last seen him, and his hair had gone more gray than black. He was 61 and looked exactly 61, which was the kind of thing she'd always respected about him. Olivia. General? Victor is fine. I know. The waitress came and he ordered coffee without looking at the menu. When she was gone, he put both hands flat on the table and looked at her like he was taking inventory. You look good, he said. I look tired. You look good and tired. There's a difference. He glanced at her hands, at the faint scar line along her left forearm. 3 years in Ashford ER. I hear you're good. I do my job. I hear you're better than good. I hear you saved a kid last spring. 17 years old, farm equipment accident. Bled through 2 protocols before you. I don't need a recap of my own cases. No, he agreed. He picked up his coffee when the waitress returned and set it down without drinking it. Walt Greer called last night. I know. He heard your call sign. I said it. I shouldn't have. She looked at the table. I was tired and someone was being dismissive and it was stupid. Was it? She looked up. Maddox had that look he got sometimes. Not calculating, not manipulative, but genuinely direct. He was one of the few people she'd ever met who said what he meant with complete consistency. It was both his best quality and his most dangerous. Someone called Marcus Doyle, just pinned captain's bars. Spent 10 minutes condescending to me last night about how ER nursing isn't real trauma medicine, she said. I said my call sign. I didn't explain anything. I didn't make a speech. I just said 2 words and left. It was the most I've said about my service history in 3 years. Doyle's in Colonel Hartman's unit, Maddox said. Hartman knows what the call sign means. I figured something like that was going to happen. It's a short chain, Olivia. Once the name surfaces, it moves. I know how it works. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the diner windows, the Saturday morning street was starting to fill. Families, a few joggers, a couple with a stroller. Normal Ashford on a normal weekend. She'd chosen this city partly for this quality. Tell me about the operational record, he said, and she shook her head. You already have it. I want to hear it from you. Why? Because I'm going to ask you something and I need to know where you are first. She looked at him for a long moment. Where I am, she said, is 3 years out. I work ER. I'm good at it. I have, she chose her words carefully, a functional life, not a complicated one. That's intentional. The last mission, he said, Hollow Reach. The name went through her the way it always went through her. Not like a knife, not dramatic, just a cold pressure in her chest that she'd learned to breathe through. There were 43 casualties, she said. I treated 31. 15 died on the field. 16 made it out. She kept her voice flat because that was the only way to say it. 2 of the ones who died were in my unit. One was 22 years old. He'd been in the field for 11 months. I held compression on his chest for 26 minutes before I accepted that he wasn't going to make it. She picked up her coffee. That's where I am. Maddox didn't say he was sorry. She'd always been grateful he wasn't the type. The program, he said. Tell me. Combat Medic Training Overhaul. We've been building the framework for 2 years, but we need someone to run the field curriculum. Someone who's done it, not who's read about it, not who's trained in simulations, someone who's actually been in the worst of it and made the hard calls. He looked at her steadily. Your name is at the top of a very short list. I have a job. Riverside would keep your position. The arrangement would be a consult. You'd lead the curriculum design and first training cohort. 8 weeks at Fort Ironwood. You'd go back after. Fort Ironwood was 40 minutes north of Ashford. She hadn't known it was there when she'd picked the city, and when she'd found out, she'd taken it as the universe confirming that nothing she did made any particular difference one way or another. Why now? She said. Because we've had 4 cases in the last 18 months where combat medics froze in the field. Not for lack of technical skill. He pressed his hands flat against the table again. For lack of preparation for what the work actually costs. Psychologically, emotionally. They could do every procedure correctly, and they still couldn't function after the first time they lost someone they'd been trained to save. He looked at her. You know the difference between training that teaches the mechanics and training that teaches the weight of it. She knew. She knew because nobody had taught her that part. She'd learned it on that mountain, with her hands inside a 22-year-old who was already gone, and she'd had to figure out how to carry it alone because there was no curriculum for that. There still wasn't. I need to think about it, she said. Take whatever time you need. A day. He nodded. He finished his coffee and put his coat back on. I'm not going to pretend this is a small ask, he said, standing. I know what you built here, the quiet of it. He glanced around the diner. The ordinary Saturday morning of it, the complete lack of anything classified or urgent or impossible. What you did in service is documented. What you've done here for 3 years without ever asking for recognition is also documented, if less formally. He looked back at her. The Army owes you a significant debt. I'm not trying to collect on it. I'm trying to give you a chance to decide what to do with it. She said nothing. He left. She sat in the corner booth for another 20 minutes with her coffee going cold, watching the street through the window. At one point, a little girl outside pressed her face against the glass on the other side and made a face at her, and Olivia made a face back before she could stop herself, and the girl burst out laughing and ran off. She left a $15 tip for a $7 check and went out into the cold October morning. Monday at Riverside was the way Mondays always were. An intake surge from the weekend, backed up charts, 2 call-ins from overnight staff that hadn't been covered, and a supply issue with the O-neg inventory that someone had been promising to fix for 3 weeks. Olivia came in at 6:45, changed, and started in on the chart backlog from overnight before the first patients of the shift hit the floor. Her charge nurse was a woman named Deb Frazier, who'd been running the ER at Riverside for 11 years and had the energy of someone half her age and the patience of someone twice it. Deb didn't particularly like to be surprised by things, but she'd long since stopped expecting Olivia to behave the way other nurses behaved. You look like you had a weekend, Deb said, passing her in the hall. I ran into some people. Good people or complicated people? Both. Deb accepted this and moved on. That was one of the things Olivia genuinely appreciated about Riverside. By and large, the people there didn't push. They were used to patients who didn't want to talk about what had brought them in, and the habit generalized. By 9, the floor was running at pace. She had a cardiac case, 2 post-surgical checks that had bounced back from upstairs, and a veteran who'd come in with what he said was a pulled muscle in his back and turned out to be a compression fracture at T4. She got him stabilized, made sure imaging was ordered, and sat with him for 5 minutes while he processed the fact that he wasn't going home the same day he'd come in. He was 64 and had served 2 tours and had the look of a man who was used to minimizing his own damage. She recognized it. This is going to take some time, she told him. How much time? Depends on the extent. The radiologist will know more this afternoon. He looked at the ceiling. I've got a grandson coming in from, doesn't matter. It does matter. Tell the orthopedist about the timing when they come in. They can work around it if it's possible. He looked at her. You think that's true, or are you just saying it? I don't say things I don't think are true, she said. It's too much work to keep track of. He half laughed, which was the goal. All right. She left him and went back to the floor. At 11:15, 2 things happened at almost the same time. The first, Marcus Doyle walked into the ER. He wasn't hurt. He was in uniform, carrying his cover in his hands, and he looked around the ER with the expression of someone who'd walked into a foreign country without a phrase book. He spotted her across the floor and stopped. She gave him a second to decide whether to approach or turn around. He approached. "Captain Doyle," she said, before he could say anything. "Are you injured?" "No, He stopped. "I just wanted to—" "I'm working." "I know. He held his cover in both hands now. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. He was genuinely uncomfortable, which was at least honest. "For Friday?" "For Friday. For the way I talked to you. It wasn't appropriate, and it wasn't respectful." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He winced slightly at the direct confirmation. "I didn't know—" "You didn't need to know anything to be respectful," she said. "That's kind of the whole point." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair." "Okay." She picked up a chart. "Apology accepted. Now please go. I have 3 patients pending and you're standing in my ER." He went. She watched him walk out through the sliding doors and turn toward the parking lot, and she felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite forgiveness, but was somewhere in the same territory. She went back to work. The second thing happened at 11:43. A man came through the ambulance bay at a dead run with a child in his arms. The child was 8, maybe 9, female, unresponsive. The man, father, uncle, older brother, she didn't know, was shouting something about a fall in a trampoline, and she didn't hear the rest because she was already moving. "Bay 3, she said, and was at the gurney before the man had fully processed where she'd come from. The child, the chart would later say her name was Maya, had a pulse, barely. Respiratory pattern was wrong, not absent, but wrong, shallow and irregular. Her pupils were unequal. Behind Olivia, the bay was filling with people who all had jobs to do. She was aware of them without cataloging them. She was aware of the father's voice, which had become a kind of white noise somewhere to her left. She was aware of the overhead lights. She was not aware of anything outside the immediate problem. "I need a GCS now," she said. "Imaging standing by. Someone get neuro on the phone." She ran her hands along the child's skull, careful, methodical, the specific focus that she'd learned in a different world entirely, on different patients, in different conditions, but which was the same underlying thing. "She's got a head injury, possible epidural. We need a CT yesterday." "BP is dropping," someone said behind her. "I know." She was already adjusting, already moving, already 3 steps ahead of the room. "Let's go, now, keep up." The bay moved with her. She didn't stop to think about Fort Ironwood or Maddox or the photograph behind the filing cabinet. She stopped thinking about all of it entirely. There was just the child on the table, and the problem that needed solving, and the window of time she had to solve it in, and all of it narrowed down to that specific and brutal and clarifying point. This was the thing about the worst kind of medicine. It made everything else stop mattering for a while. It was the only thing she'd ever found that did. The monitor spiked. Someone called a number. She was already moving before they finished the sentence, hands steady, mind clear, operating in the specific register where she'd always been best. Not in the quiet moments, but in the moments when something irreplaceable was in danger of being lost. The child's blood pressure dropped again, sharp and fast, and the room shifted into a different gear entirely. The monitor spiked again, and Olivia called for a second IV line before the echo of the first alarm had finished, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone who had run out of room for anything except what needed doing next. Maya, the chart had a last name now, Tremblay, father named Paul, 37, standing in the hallway because someone had correctly made him leave, was in active neurological decline. The CT request was already in. The problem was the 11 minutes between now and when imaging would have an answer, and the blood pressure that kept sliding in the wrong direction like it had somewhere else to be. "She's posturing," said the resident behind her, a second-year named Gavin Rourke, who was good under pressure in the way that second years were sometimes good, which meant he was reliable until the situation exceeded his pattern matching. "I see it." She did. The arms, the angle. She adjusted. "Pull the attending. Get Dr. Osei down here now. not when he's finished with whatever he's finishing. He's in a consult. I know where he is. Go get him anyway. Rourke went. The nurse on her left, a travel nurse named Bex, who'd been at Riverside 6 weeks and was still learning the floor's rhythms but moved fast and didn't ask unnecessary questions, was already running the second line, and Olivia appreciated her for it without having the bandwidth to say so. The next 9 minutes were the kind of 9 minutes that didn't feel like 9 minutes in either direction. They were dense and specific and required everything she had. And she gave everything she had. And when Dr. Kwame Osei came through the bay doors, still in his white coat from the consult, she gave him the handoff in 40 seconds flat. Condition, intervention, current status, what she suspected, what she'd already ruled out, and stepped back exactly far enough to let him lead while staying close enough to catch anything he missed. He didn't miss much. He was a good attending, and she'd known that for 2 years. Epidural hematoma, he said after he'd run his own assessment. We need neuro up here, and we need them moving. He glanced at Olivia. Good catch on the posturing. Bex caught it first, she said, which was approximately true. They moved Maya to imaging at 12:04. The scan confirmed it. She was in surgery by 12:40 with a pediatric neurosurgeon who'd been paged from a conference call and had arrived still holding his reading glasses in one hand. Olivia stood in the hallway outside the surgical floor and let her hands unclench. Paul Tremblay was 20 feet away, sitting in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He was the kind of man who was probably usually composed. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he was working very hard not to fall apart in a public corridor. She walked over and sat down in the chair next to him, not because it was her job, and not because the moment had passed and she had time to spare, but because he was alone, and the chair was empty, and some things were just that simple. She's in surgery, she said. The neurosurgeon is good. The scan showed what we needed it to show, and we got her there fast. He lifted his face. His eyes were red. Is she going to be okay? I can't promise you that, she said. What I can tell you is that everything that could be done in the time we had was done. He stared at her. That's not... He stopped. I know that's the honest answer. She was on the trampoline and then she wasn't, and He pressed his hands over his face again. She sat with him for 4 minutes without saying anything else, and then she went back to the floor because there were 3 more patients who needed her, and the morning kept going. But she didn't make a decision about Fort Ironwood that day or the next. She went to work. She came home. She ate food that was adequate and slept in intervals and thought about it in the margins of everything else. She thought about it the way she thought about hard cases, running the approach, checking for the things she might have missed, circling back. The problem wasn't the job itself. She understood the job. She understood why she was being asked. She even understood in the detached way she understood most things why Maddox had framed it the way he had. Not as obligation, not as debt, but as choice. The problem was the thing that Hollow Reach had left in her, and whether she was willing to walk back into the territory it lived in. On Wednesday evening, she went to see Walt Greer. His office was a converted auto repair shop on the east side, which was a strange choice until you understood that most of the veterans who came through his program were more comfortable in a place that still smelled faintly of oil and had mismatched furniture and no inspirational posters on the walls. He was behind his desk when she came in, reading something on paper rather than a screen, which was a habit she'd always found oddly reassuring. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. He had the grace not to look guilty. I told you I'd make you buy me a beer, she said. I heard. He set the papers down. Sit. She sat. His desk had 3 empty coffee cups on it and a photograph of a mountain that she didn't recognize. He looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who'd spent decades evaluating people in high-stakes situations and had stopped trying to be subtle about it. You're thinking about it, he said. I'm always thinking about things. That's not a conclusion. No. But the fact that you came here instead of just staying annoyed at me from a distance is a conclusion. She granted him that with a slight tilt of her head. Why did you call them, Walt? He was quiet for a moment, not stalling. He wasn't a stalling kind of person, just accurate. Because I recognized the call sign and I recognized what you looked like when you said it, And I've seen enough people spend the rest of their lives folded around something they should have opened up a long time ago. He picked up one of the coffee cups, realized it was empty, set it back down. You're good at your job. You're very good. But I watch you in there sometimes, and you're operating on about 60% of what you actually have. The rest of it is somewhere else. That's a lot of presumption from a Monday morning visit. I've been doing this for 12 years. I presume things. He looked at her steadily. Maddox is a straight shooter. Whatever he told you, he means it. I know he means it. That's not the question. What's the question? She looked at the photograph of the mountain for a moment. Whether I can teach people how to handle something I'm not sure I've handled. He was quiet for a beat. Then, you know what the difference is between people who've handled something and people who are qualified to teach it? She waited. Nothing, he said. That's the only honest answer. The people who've genuinely handled it usually can't teach it because they've filed it away somewhere clean and they can't access it anymore. The people who are still carrying it, still sitting with the weight of it, those are the people who can tell recruits what it actually is. He leaned back. You think the ones who've made peace with it are the right teachers? Or the ones who can still feel what it cost? She didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. You already know what you're going to do, he said. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything. I'm just reading the room. She left without confirming or denying it, which they both understood as confirmation. She called Maddox Thursday morning. One condition, she said before he'd finished his greeting. The curriculum includes a mandatory module on the emotional and psychological cost of field decisions, not as a footnote, as a core component, and it's assessed the same way the technical skills are assessed. Done, he said. I'm not finished. I want input on the assessment criteria, not rubber stamp, actual input. If I'm building the framework, I need to trust that it doesn't get watered down once I hand it over. I'll put it in writing. Good, she paused. 8 weeks. 8 weeks. Fort Ironwood. First cohort of 68. I'll need the existing curriculum sent to me before I start. Everything they're currently using. I'm not building in a vacuum. It'll be at your apartment by tomorrow morning. She was quiet for a moment. You already had it ready. I had it ready 2 years ago, he said. I just didn't know where you were. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything. I'll talk to Deb today. I can start in 3 weeks. I'll have your access credentials and base clearance set up by end of week. She hung up and stood in her kitchen again. Same counter, same window, different morning. The coffee was better this time. She'd finally replaced the grounds she'd been stretching too long. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. She told Deb that afternoon. Deb Fraser listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Olivia finished, Deb was quiet for a moment with her arms crossed and her expression doing something complicated. 8 weeks, Deb said finally. 8 weeks. Fort Ironwood. And then you come back. That's the arrangement. Deb looked at her. Olivia, I've worked with you for 3 years and I think I know roughly 12% of who you actually are. I'm saying that as a compliment. She uncrossed her arms. What you're describing, this curriculum, this training program, is that something you want to do or something you feel like you owe? It was a better question than Olivia had expected. She held it for a second. Both, probably. Good, Deb said. Both is honest. She picked up the clipboard she'd set down when Olivia had started talking. I'll have HR start the leave paperwork. You're taking 3 weeks of your banked PTO and the rest on an approved temporary assignment. Don't argue with me about it. You have 47 days accrued and it's embarrassing. I wasn't going to argue. You were about to. I saw your face. Deb was already moving. Go check on the Tremblay girl. Her father has been asking about you. Maya Tremblay had been moved to the pediatric ICU after surgery. She'd made it through, which was not guaranteed, but was also not a surprise to anyone who'd been in that bay on Monday. Olivia went up to the 4th floor and found Paul Tremblay in the hallway outside the PICU, looking like a man who'd been wrung out and hung up to dry but was still standing. He saw her and stood up straighter. The surgeon said she's going to be okay, he said. They think full recovery. Good. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. I wanted to say thank you, properly. I know you probably hear that a lot. Not as often as you'd think, she said. He looked at her for a moment. My wife is coming in tonight. She was in Denver when it happened. She drove back the same day. He was filling the space with words, which was what people did when they were trying to say something they weren't sure how to say. She wants to thank you too. I wanted to warn you. She's a crier. That's all right. I'm also a crier, apparently, which I found out on Monday. He said it with the specific self-deprecating humor of a man who was still processing something that had shaken him down to the foundation. I thought I was pretty tough. Turns out there's a limit. There's always a limit, Olivia said. Knowing where yours is isn't a weakness. He looked at her like she'd said something that landed in a specific place. Is that something they teach you? In nursing? No, she said. I learned it somewhere else. She didn't elaborate and he didn't push, and she went back to the floor. The envelope arrived Friday morning, left with her building's front office. A standard military transfer envelope. No return address, she recognized, but it had the weight of a full curriculum packet. She took it inside and read it over 2 hours at her kitchen table with coffee and the specific focus she saved for things that were going to require her full attention. It was worse than she'd expected. Not wrong, exactly. The technical content was solid. Procedures, protocols, equipment, the mechanics of field medicine laid out in clear and testable steps. But it was built like a machine instruction manual. No acknowledgement that the person following those steps was a human being who would be making those decisions inside an event that was trying to kill them. No preparation for the moment when the procedure worked and the patient still died, or the procedure failed and there was nothing left to try, or the chaos exceeded the protocol and a medic had to make a call that nobody had trained them to make. She'd been a 23-year-old corpsman the first time she'd faced a situation that exceeded her training, and the only reason she'd survived it, not physically, but in the way that mattered longer term, was that she'd had a senior medic named Sergeant Della Torres who'd pulled her aside 2 days later and talked to her for 3 hours about what had happened and what it meant and what she was allowed to feel about it. Nobody had sent Della Torres to do that. It wasn't protocol. She'd just done it because it was the thing that needed doing. Della Torres had been in that photograph behind the filing cabinet. She was one of the two who hadn't come back. Olivia sat with the curriculum for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and started writing notes. She was still writing at 11:30 when her phone rang. The number wasn't one she recognized. She almost let it go. She answered it. Ms. Carter. The voice was male, flat, and professionally neutral in the way that wasn't natural neutrality, but practice neutrality. The kind that came from legal training or from years of managing situations where tone could be used as evidence. My name is Gerald Pratton. I'm the Administrative Director of Riverside Veterans Medical Center. I apologize for the late hour. She looked at the clock. It was 11:32. What can I do for you, Mr. Pratton? I'd like to discuss your position at Riverside. A pause. Specifically, we've become aware of certain matters relating to your background that require administrative review. She was quiet for a moment. My leave is already approved. I spoke with my charge nurse. This isn't about the leave. Another pause, more weighted than the first. I'm referring to your service record, specifically the classified nature of portions of it, and the fact that this information was not fully disclosed during your initial employment application. She felt something settle in her chest, not panic, not even surprise, more like a recognition. The way you recognized a specific type of bad weather because you'd been in it before. My application disclosed all legally required information. Classified service history is exempt from civilian employment disclosure under federal regulation. That may be the case, Pratton said. However, there's been a formal inquiry filed. By whom? A pause. I'm not in a position to share that at this stage of the review. Then we don't have much to discuss tonight, she said. If there's a formal proceeding, I'll respond through formal channels. Ms. Carter, I want to be clear. This isn't a termination notice. This is a preliminary. I understand what it is, she said. Good night, Mr. Pratton. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table with the curriculum notes in front of her and her phone in her hand and thought about the chain of events that led from Friday night at Decker's to a call from the administrative director of her hospital on a Friday night at 11:30. Someone had made a move. Not Doyle. Doyle wasn't that kind of player, and his apology had been genuine. Not Maddox. This wasn't how Maddox operated. Someone who'd found out about her background through the same chain Greer had started, and who had decided that the information was more useful as a weapon than a record. She thought about who at Riverside had the institutional access to file a formal inquiry and the motivation to do so. The list was shorter than it should have been and longer than she would have liked. She put her phone down. She picked up the curriculum notes. She kept writing. The next morning, she arrived at Riverside an hour before her shift and went straight to human resources. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Cole, mid-50s, who ran her department with the precision of someone who had seen every possible personnel situation and was no longer impressed by any of them. She looked up when Olivia appeared in her doorway. "I was expecting you," Sandra said. "Pratton called me last night." "I know. He also called me this morning before 7, which is—" Sandra gestured to a chair. "Sit down." Olivia sat. "Do you want to tell me about the service record, or do you want me to tell you what I already know?" "What do you already know?" "I know that classified portions of a military service record are legally exempt from civilian employment disclosure. I know your application was complete and accurate as required." Sandra folded her hands on her desk. "I also know that someone accessed your personnel file in this building 48 hours ago without authorization, and that the inquiry Pratton filed is based on information from that file, plus additional information from a source that is not within this hospital's authority." Olivia looked at her. "Who accessed the file?" "We're working on that." Sandra's expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a specific tightness that wasn't there in routine personnel conversations. "What I need from you today is your documentation. Everything establishing the legality of your disclosure. Military records, exemption filings, your DD-214, whatever you have. I can have it here by this afternoon. Please do." Sandra looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who had made a decision and wanted her to know it. "I want you to understand something. Gerald Pratton does not make employment decisions. I do. And I have reviewed your record and your performance evaluations for 3 years, and there is no proceeding in this office that is going to change what I see when I look at those." She paused. "But someone is trying to make trouble for you, and I need documentation to make sure they can't." "I understand. Do you have any idea who?" Olivia thought about it. The access, the timing, the specific nature of the inquiry. Not random, not opportunistic. Someone who had been waiting for a reason or who had been given one recently. "I have a suspicion," she said. "I don't have evidence." "Keep the suspicion to yourself for now. Let me do this the right way." She left Sandra's office and stood in the corridor for a moment. The floor was already filling up. The morning rush, patients moving, the familiar cadence of the ER floor tuning up for the day. She knew this hallway. She knew the sound of it, the rhythm of it. She'd spent 3 years learning to belong to it. Whatever this was, she wasn't going to be moved out of it by a phone call. She went to work. But by noon, word had moved. She could feel it, the specific shift in how people looked at her when they passed, not hostile, mostly curious, a few of them something closer to uncomfortable. Deb Frazier pulled her into the supply corridor at 2 and said, straight out, "Someone's been talking. I don't know who and I don't know what exactly, but there's a version of a story going around this floor that has your name in it." "What version?" "That you falsified your application, that there's an investigation." Deb's expression was sharp. "Which is garbage, and I've said so to everyone who's come to me with it, but garbage spreads." "I know." "Olivia." Deb stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Not hard, just definite. This isn't your fault, and it's not small. Whatever you need from me, testimony, records, me standing in someone's office and being very loud, you have it." She looked at Deb for a moment. 3 years, and she'd never told Deb anything about where she'd come from or what she'd done before Riverside. Deb had never asked. She'd just watched the work and made her own conclusions. "Thank you," Olivia said. "I mean it. Don't thank me. Find whoever started this and make sure Sandra Cole gets their name." She went back to the floor. At 4:15, she was in the middle of a medication review when Rourke, the second-year resident, appeared beside her with an expression she'd never seen on him. Tight, uncertain, like he was delivering news he didn't want to be responsible for. "Someone's here," he said. "Not a patient. They're asking for you by name. Front desk said they have federal credentials." She looked up from the chart. "What kind of federal?" "They didn't say, but there are two of them, and they're not in uniform." She handed the chart to the nurse on her left and walked toward the front entrance. She came around the corner and stopped. Standing at the front desk, speaking quietly with the receptionist, were two individuals in civilian clothes who had the specific bearing of people who were federal law enforcement, not military, not hospital administration, but the kind of credential that came from a different category of authority entirely. The one facing her looked up. He was maybe 45, dark-haired, with the kind of face that didn't give information away. He held up a badge that she didn't need to read to recognize the agency it came from. "Olivia Carter?" "Yes." "My name is Special Agent Darren Falk. This is my partner, Special Agent Teo Brancato." He held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of someone who was very good at reading the room. "We're with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We'd like to speak with you privately." She looked at him for a long moment. "About what?" "About the person who accessed your personnel file," Falk said. "And about what they were looking for." He paused. "Ms. Carter, we think you're not the only one they've been investigating, and the situation is a little more complicated than a personnel inquiry." The noise of the ER floor continued behind her. Someone called a number. A monitor beeped 3 times. She looked at Agent Falk, and she looked at the badge, and she thought about the phone call from Pratton, and Sandra Cole's expression that morning, and the chain that had started in a bar on Friday night with 2 words she'd said out loud for the first time in 3 years. "All right," she said, "give me 5 minutes." She went to find Deb, and the look on Deb's face when Olivia told her she needed to step away for a few minutes was the look of someone who had understood, from the moment she walked back to the floor, that whatever was coming was bigger than a personnel inquiry. It was. She just didn't know yet how much bigger. She led them to a family consultation room off the main corridor, the one with the frosted glass door and the chairs that were slightly too soft, the room where she'd delivered hard news more times than she'd counted. She closed the door and stood with her back to it because she wasn't going to sit down for this. Falk took the chair closest to the table. Brancato stood near the window, which told her something about how they divided their roles. Falk talked. Brancato watched. "We'll be direct," Falk said. "The individual who accessed your personnel file is a man named Royce Heller. He's the Deputy Operations Director at Riverside. Reports to Pratton." She knew the name. Not well. Heller was administration, the kind of mid-level institutional figure who existed in the background of every large facility, managing budgets and compliance reports, and staying largely invisible to clinical staff. She'd seen him in the hallways maybe 6 times. "How long has he had access to personnel records?" she said. "That's not actually the right question." Falk put a folder on the table but didn't open it. "Heller's access is legitimate. What he did with what he found is not. He pulled your file, ran your name through a separate database that he does not have clearance to access, and then made contact with 2 individuals outside this hospital who have a documented interest in discrediting military personnel connected to Operation Hollow Reach." The room went quiet in a specific way. "Say that again," she said. "There's a network, loosely organized but active, that's been working for approximately 4 years to suppress or discredit testimony connected to Hollow Reach. We believe it originates with contractors who had financial exposure from that operation, the kind of exposure that becomes criminal liability if the right testimony reaches the right oversight body." Falk looked at her steadily. "You're not their first target. You're their most recent one. And you're the most significant because your operational record from that mission is the most complete documentation of what actually happened on that mountain." She was standing very still. "What happened on that mountain is classified." "Yes, which is why they need the testimony discredited before it can be declassified." Brancato spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Falk's, more precise. "They can't access the operational record directly. But if they can establish that you falsified your employment application, even a minor procedural violation, they create a credibility problem, a documented one, something that follows you into any future proceeding. She thought about Pratton's call, the specific timing of it. Heller fed Pratton the inquiry. Pratton may not know the full picture, Falk said. He may genuinely believe it's a legitimate HR matter, or he may know more than he's telling. We're not there yet. He finally opened the folder. He turned it so she could see the top page. A communication log, names redacted, timestamps intact. What we need from you is a formal statement, your operational account of Hollow Reach to the extent it can be declassified, corroborating the record that already exists in the military archive. He paused. We also need you to know that Heller isn't the end of this chain. He's a link, and the people further up that chain have been watching this facility since your name surfaced Friday night. She looked at the communication log. The timestamp started Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after she'd said 2 words in a bar. How did they move that fast? She said. They've had a flag on your name for 2 years, Brancato said. They just didn't know where you were. The same thing Maddox had said from a completely different direction. She looked at the folder. She looked at Falk. If I give you the statement, what happens to my position here? Sandra Call has already been briefed. The inquiry Pratton filed will be withdrawn by end of business today. Falk closed the folder. Your job is not at risk. It was never legitimately at risk. This was harassment dressed up as process. That's not what I asked, she said. I asked what happens. Not what doesn't happen. He held her gaze. Heller will be referred for prosecution. The individuals he contacted will be investigated. The network we're talking about, the contractors, the people managing the suppression effort. That's a federal proceeding that's been building for 18 months. Your statement is one piece of it, a significant piece, but one piece. He leaned forward slightly. And when that proceeding goes forward, your name is going to be public. Your record is going to be public. You won't be Ghost Angel in a classified file anymore. She absorbed that. The full weight of it, which was not small. 3 years. She'd built 3 years of ordinary life around the specific fact of being a name in a classified file. She'd made peace with the kind of invisibility that came from being known only to the right people in the right context, and not known at all to anyone else. She'd treated it like a choice she'd made freely, and maybe she had, but she'd also been making it within the narrow geography of what she'd believed was possible. It turned out someone had been trying to make that geography even narrower. Someone had been waiting for her name to surface so they could bury it again, differently this time. Not in a classified file, but in a personnel inquiry, a credibility problem, a cloud that would follow her into any room where the truth of what happened on that mountain might matter. She thought about the 22-year-old she'd held compression on for 26 minutes. She thought about Dela Torres. She thought about the 15 who hadn't made it out, and the 16 who had, and the 31 she'd touched in some way in between. When do you need the statement? She said. Monday, Falk said. We can do it here or at our field office. Your preference. Here. She would not go to their space for this. Monday morning, 7 a.m., before my shift. Falk nodded and stood. Brancato was already at the door. Miss Carter. Falk paused with his hand on the doorframe. For what it's worth, the people who've been working this case for 18 months know what happened on that mountain. They know what you did. He said it without drama, without the particular weight people sometimes put on things like that to make themselves feel like they'd offered something meaningful. He said it like a fact. Monday. He left. Brancato followed. She stood alone in the consultation room with its 2 soft chairs and its frosted glass and the faint antiseptic smell that lived in every room in this building. She stood there for approximately 90 seconds, which was the maximum she was going to allow herself, and then she opened the door and went back to the floor. She had 2 patients waiting and a chart that needed signing and 3 hours left in her shift. She did all 3. She got home at 8. She didn't open her laptop. She didn't review the curriculum notes. She went to the second bedroom, moved the filing cabinet, and looked at the photograph for a long time. 7 people. Mountain terrain, snow on the ridgeline. She picked it up. She hadn't touched it in 3 years. And she carried it to the living room and set it on the shelf above the television where she would see it every day. Not because everything was resolved, not because the weight of it had changed, because hiding it had been a choice she'd made when she thought she was the only person still carrying it. And it turned out that wasn't true. It had never been true. There were federal agents who had been building a case for 18 months. There were contractors who'd been afraid of what she knew for 4 years. There was a general who'd kept her name on a list and driven to a diner in Ashford on a Saturday morning. People didn't put that much effort into something that didn't matter. She sat on her couch and looked at the photograph on the shelf, and after a while she turned out the light and sat in the dark for a few minutes, which was something she'd always needed to do at the end of days that were too full. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize, but the area code was military. Not Colorado Springs, not Ashford. Out of state. She answered. The voice on the other end wasn't Falk, wasn't Brancato, wasn't Maddox or Greer or anyone she'd spoken to this week. It was a woman's voice, low and urgent, and it said one sentence before the call dropped. Olivia, they're not just going after your record, they're going after the survivors. She called Falk at 8:17. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep, which meant she wasn't the only one who'd had a long evening. The call dropped before I could ask anything, she said. Female voice, one sentence, area code that looked like it was routing through a Virginia exchange. She said they're going after the survivors. A pause. Not a processing pause, a knowing pause. Did you recognize the voice? No. Okay. Another pause, shorter. Don't call back. If she wants to reach you again, she will. And Olivia, is your apartment secure? She looked around her living room, the ordinary furniture, the photograph on the shelf, the locked front door with its standard deadbolt. Define secure. Lock your door. Don't answer if someone comes unannounced tonight. We'll have someone outside your building within the hour. He said it without making it sound alarming, which somehow made it more alarming. The statement still happens Monday. Nothing about that changes, but I need you to stay put tonight. Who are the survivors, she said. The ones being targeted. Monday, he said. Falk. Monday, he said again, and this time it wasn't deflection but instruction, and she understood the difference. He wasn't withholding to protect turf. He was withholding because the line wasn't secure, and he didn't know how long it had been compromised. She hung up and checked her deadbolt. She sat on the couch with the lights off and the photograph on the shelf visible in the ambient light from the window, and she thought about who among the people who'd been on that mountain was still out there and could be reached. She knew of 4 survivors besides herself. She'd deliberately not tracked them, which had felt, for 3 years, like a form of self-preservation. It had been, she understood now, also a form of avoidance. She didn't sleep much. Monday came gray and cold, a thin cloud cover that turned the morning light flat and honest. She arrived at Riverside at 6:40, 30 minutes before Falk, and used the time to sit in the family consultation room alone with a cup of coffee that she didn't particularly want and the working knowledge that whatever she was about to say in this room would exist in a federal record for longer than she would. She'd written notes over the weekend, not a prepared statement. She didn't work that way, and anyone who debriefed her before knew it. Just timestamps, sequencing, the kind of structural markers that kept a narrative from collapsing under its own weight when you were telling it out loud. She'd burned the notes Saturday night and rewritten them Sunday morning, which was how she knew she had the sequence right. Falk arrived at 7:02 with Brancato and a third person she hadn't met. A woman in her late 40s with short gray hair and a recorder she placed on the table without asking permission, which Olivia understood as a statement of authority rather than rudeness. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Margot Severin, Falk said. She's been leading the federal case. Severin looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had been waiting to be in this room for a while. Miss Carter, thank you for agreeing to this. You can thank me when it's done, Olivia said. Severin almost smiled. Fair. They ran the statement for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Olivia spoke in the flat, sequential way she'd learned to give field reports. Not embellished, not compressed, just accurate. She told them what she'd seen on that mountain, what she'd done, what she'd witnessed in the 48 hours before and after the main engagement. She told them about the contractor personnel who had been embedded with the unit under a cover designation that hadn't matched their actual function. She told them about the equipment that had failed and why she didn't believe it had failed accidentally, and what she'd said about it in her immediate post-mission debrief, and the fact that the section of that debrief referencing the contractor personnel had been redacted in the version she'd been shown upon return. She told them about the 22-year-old. She told them about Dela Torres. She told them all of it without stopping, without revising, without the specific protective distance she'd maintained for 3 years. It was the hardest 90 minutes of recent memory, and she got through it the same way she got through hard things in the ER, by staying inside the problem and not looking at the edges of it until she was done. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Severin stopped the recorder. "I need to tell you something," she said. "The female caller Saturday night was... We identified the number. It was a former signals officer named Petra Wall. She was attached to a support unit during Hollow Reach. She's been in contact with our office before, but she broke off communication 8 months ago." Severin looked at her steadily. "She reached out to you specifically because she believes you're the one person whose statement could move this case from investigation to indictment." Olivia looked at the recorder. "Where is she now?" "We don't know. She's been moving, but the fact that she called you suggests she's ready to come in. She just needed to know you were in too." Severin picked up the recorder and set it in her bag. "What you've given us today corroborates 3 other depositions and fills 2 significant gaps in the evidentiary record. I want you to understand what that means. The individuals who authorized the suppression of the Hollow Reach operational records, the contractor side of this, the people who have been running the discrediting campaign, they're going to be named in a federal indictment. That is not a possibility. It is a timeline." "How long?" "Weeks, not months." She absorbed that. "And Heller?" "Referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver as of this morning," Falk said. "He's already lawyered up, which means he already knows what he was part of was more than a personnel inquiry." "What about Pratton?" "Still sorting his level of involvement. He may be a secondary victim here rather than a participant. Heller fed him enough to make a legitimate-seeming HR concern without telling him the full picture." Falk paused. "That determination will be made by the end of the week." She stood up. She had 12 minutes before her shift started. "One more thing," Severin said. She reached into her bag and set a single document on the table. A letterhead she recognized, the Army Surgeon General's office. "General Maddox submitted a formal commendation request on your behalf last week. It's been approved. The ceremony, if you want one, would be at Fort Ironwood, concurrent with the launch of the training program." She looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. "I'll think about it," she said. She went to work. Buttoned. The floor that morning had the particular energy of a place where something had shifted, but nobody was entirely sure what. She'd been at Riverside long enough to know that institutional rumors moved faster than institutional facts, and whatever Sandra Cole and Deb Frazier had and hadn't said over the weekend had created a specific kind of static, not hostile but charged. She treated it the same way she treated any other ambient pressure. She did her job. Deb found her at 9:30 during a momentary gap between patients. "Sandra Cole wants to see you at noon." Her words were brief and good news, which from Sandra means exactly that. "I know." Deb studied her. "You look like you ran a marathon in your sleep." "Close." "Are you okay?" She thought about the question seriously, which she didn't always do. "I will be," she said, which was honest in a way that okay wouldn't have been. Deb accepted it and moved on. That was one of the things she'd always valued most about Deb. The woman had an accurate instinct for when to push and when to let the answer be what it was. At noon, Sandra Cole's office was quiet and orderly, which matched Sandra herself. She gestured to a chair and got to the point within 30 seconds of Olivia sitting down. "The inquiry Pratton filed has been formally withdrawn. DCIS contacted our legal team this morning, and the matter is closed on our end. I've added documentation to your personnel file clarifying the exemption status of your classified service record, which means this cannot be re-raised by anyone without triggering an immediate legal response." Sandra folded her hands. "Gerald Pratton has been placed on administrative leave pending the determination of what he knew and when he knew it. Royce Heller has been terminated for cause and referred for federal prosecution." She paused. "I want to be clear. None of this reflects on your standing here. Your position is unchanged, your evaluations stand, and your approved leave for Fort Ironwood is fully in place. Thank you, Sandra. Don't thank me. I did paperwork. Sandra looked at her with a directness that wasn't unfriendly. I will say one thing that's outside my official capacity. Whatever you did before you came here, whoever you were before you were an ER nurse at Riverside, I think this hospital has been better for having you in it. Deb Frazier has said as much to me at least 4 times, and she doesn't say things 4 times unless she means them 11. She picked up a pen. That's all? Olivia stood. The paperwork you did matters, she said. I know it doesn't feel like the dramatic part, but it's the part that actually holds. Sandra looked up. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, the way things shifted in people when they were told something they needed to hear. Go have lunch, she said. The week moved the way weeks moved when things were in motion beneath the surface. Faster than it felt in the moment. Slower than the urgency warranted. She finished her notes on the Fort Ironwood curriculum. She got a second call from Maddox confirming her start date, and a third call from Colonel Voss about base access credentials, and a brief email from Falk saying that Petra Wall had been located in Reno and was cooperating with the federal investigation. She also got a call from Marcus Doyle. She almost didn't answer. She answered. I heard some of what happened, he said. With your record, the inquiry. He paused. I don't know how much of it was connected to Friday night, but I know it started Friday night, and I want you to know I didn't. I know you didn't, she said. I feel responsible. You're not. She meant it. You asked for a call sign, and I gave you one. The rest of it was already in motion before you sat down next to me. She paused. The thing you actually are responsible for is the way you spoke to me before that. The nursing comment. Silence on the line. I know, he said. I'm not asking for another apology. I'm telling you because you should carry it. The way you talk to the people who patch your guys back together, that matters. The ones who do this work well enough to look like they're not doing anything special. That's not ordinariness. That's years of practice at something very hard. She stopped. She wasn't going to lecture him. That's it. Okay, he said, quietly, the way people said things when they were actually hearing them. For what it's worth, the men in my unit who've been through Riverside ER, they all say the same thing about you, that you're the one they want in the room. She didn't say anything to that. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, Captain. She hung up and went back to the curriculum notes. Gonche. The indictments came on a Wednesday. She was on shift when Falk texted. 2 words. It's done. And she was in the middle of a blood pressure assessment, and she finished the assessment, recorded the reading, and then stood in the hallway for approximately 30 seconds processing it. 4 individuals. She learned the names that evening from a news brief that ran on the local Ashford station and got picked up nationally by morning. A former defense contractor executive named Terrence Gould, 2 senior employees of a private logistics firm called Halvard Group that had held contracts tied to the classified mission, and a 4th individual whose name she recognized immediately as the man who had overseen the redaction of her post-mission debrief. The charges included obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and, the one that landed with the most weight, witness intimidation in connection with a pending national security proceeding. Royce Heller's charges were filed separately. 2 counts of unauthorized access to federal personnel records and 1 count of conspiracy. He had cooperated, which would reduce his exposure. The people further up the chain had not cooperated, which would not. She read the brief twice and then set her phone down and made dinner. Pasta. Simple, the kind of thing that took 20 minutes, and ate it at her kitchen table looking at the photograph on the shelf. 7 people. Snow on the ridgeline. 2 of them were gone. 1 was in Phoenix. 1 had called her from a payphone in Reno and then walked into a federal office and told the truth for 4 hours. 2 she still hadn't found. She thought about finding them. She thought it might be time. 2 days after the indictments, Gerald Pratton resigned. The letter went to the hospital board on a Friday morning and was common knowledge by noon, which was how things worked at Riverside. She heard it from Bex, the travel nurse, who had gotten it from radiology, who had gotten it from someone on the administrative floor. The letter, Bex said, cited personal reasons. Do you think it's actually personal reasons? Bex asked. I think he made choices, Olivia said, and now he's making another one. She felt nothing particularly dramatic about it. The inquiry he'd filed had been withdrawn. The process had worked, which was not nothing. The process worked a lot less often than it was supposed to, and she didn't take it for granted. But she also didn't feel the particular satisfaction that movies promised you would arrive when the antagonist exited the stage. She felt something more like, okay, that happened. What's next? What was next was her last week at Riverside before Fort Ironwood. Deb organized a small send-off in the break room. Nothing elaborate, because Olivia had specifically requested nothing elaborate, and Deb had specifically ignored that request in the specific way that meant she'd scaled it back from what she'd actually wanted to do. There was a sheet cake with the Riverside logo and blue frosting and a card that had been signed by everyone on the ER floor and which she read in the bathroom because she didn't want to do it in front of people. Rourke, the second-year resident, had written, "You fixed something in every room you walked into. I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to figure out how." She folded the card and put it in her bag and went back out to the break room and ate a piece of cake and talked to her colleagues and was, for an hour, fully present in a room full of people who knew her by 3 years of ordinary work and didn't know anything else. And that was its own kind of complete. Fort Ironwood was 40 minutes north of Ashford on a highway that ran through high country. And on the morning she drove up for the first time, the mountains were clear and the light was the particular sharp gold of early November at altitude. She'd driven this highway before, once, in her first month in Ashford, when she'd realized where the base was and had turned around 12 miles in and gone home. She didn't turn around this time. The base was smaller than Fort Bragg, larger than the training outpost she'd cycled through during service, and had the specific organized utilitarian look of a facility that took its function seriously without performing it. She badged in at the main gate, got her orientation packet from a staff sergeant who was efficient and professionally incurious, and drove to the building where the training program would run. Maddox was already there. He was standing outside the building in his uniform, hands behind his back, looking at the mountains. He turned when he heard her car. "How was the drive?" he said. "Fine. The building's good. They finished the renovation last month. The simulation bay is state-of-the-art, which you'll either appreciate or have opinions about." "Both, probably." He almost smiled. He walked with her to the entrance and held the door, which was not something he did as a power move, but simply because he'd been brought up in an era that did that and had never stopped. Inside, the building smelled like fresh paint and industrial carpet. The main training room was large and well lit, with a configuration she could already see needed adjustment. She'd note it in writing and make the request through the right channels and not simply move the furniture herself, which was her instinct. 68 recruits, she said. "When do they arrive?" "Monday. You have the weekend to settle in." He walked with her through the simulation bay, the supply room, the small instructor's office that had her name on a placard, on the door in a font that was somehow both official and slightly too cheerful. "The existing curriculum is flagged with your annotations. Everything I want to keep, everything I'm replacing, and everything I'm adding. The psychological component is 20% of the assessed curriculum, same weight as trauma protocol. I want that clear before the first day. It's in the program structure. In writing." "In writing," he confirmed. She stopped in the middle of the simulation bay and looked around at the space. The medical equipment in labeled bays, the scenario platforms designed to replicate field conditions, the controlled chaos of a place built to teach people how to function inside the worst moments of their professional lives. It smelled like antiseptic and rubber and the faint ozone of electrical equipment, and it reminded her of rooms she hadn't been in for 3 years. She'd expected to feel more resistance to it. She felt something else. Not comfort, not readiness exactly, but a kind of recognition. The acknowledgement that this was a thing she knew how to do, and that there were 68 people who were going to need to know how to do it, and that the gap between those two facts was exactly the size and shape of the thing she'd been carrying since she'd come home. "I want to meet the program coordinator before Monday," she said. "She's in the building. I'll introduce you. And I want the recruits' files. All 68. Not the summaries, the full records. They'll be in your office by tonight." She turned and looked at him. He looked back, the same way he always looked, direct, without agenda, the rare quality of a person who was completely present in a conversation. "Why didn't you look harder?" she said. 2 years. You said the name was on a list. You could have found me in 2 weeks if you'd pushed it." He was quiet for a moment. "You earned the right to be left alone," he said. "I wasn't going to take that away from you just because I needed something." It was the right answer. She'd known it would be. That was the problem with Victor Maddox. He almost always had the right answer, which made it very difficult to stay at a useful distance from him. "Okay," she said. She went to meet the program coordinator. Her name was Major Layla Alkafour, late 30s, a former field medic instructor who'd done 2 tours and transitioned to training 5 years ago, and had the particular credibility of someone who'd built institutional knowledge without losing the field instincts that made it useful. She looked at Olivia the way people sometimes looked at her when they knew the record. Not deferential exactly, but recalibrated. The way you recalibrated when the person in front of you didn't match the category you'd put them in. "I read the curriculum notes," Okafor said. They were in the instructor's office. The door open, coffee that was adequate but not good. The psychological assessment component. How do you want to handle recruits who push back on it? What do you mean, push back? Some of them are going to see it as soft, as secondary. The tactical and medical components, they get. The emotional cost piece, there are going to be recruits who think that's for someone else to deal with, someone outside the program. "I know." Olivia looked at the desk, her desk, for the next 8 weeks. The files of 68 people she hadn't met yet. "I'm going to tell them, on day 1, about a mission. I'm not going to give them details they don't have clearance for, but I'm going to tell them what happened when a 22-year-old medic in a classified theater lost a patient he'd been trained to save, and wasn't given any framework for carrying it, and what happened to him afterward." She paused. "And then I'm going to tell them I'm the one who held compression on that patient for 26 minutes, and that nobody gave me a framework either, and that I spent 3 years in a civilian ER running at 60% because of it. And then I'm going to tell them that this module exists so that they don't have to figure it out alone in a parking lot somewhere at 2 in the morning. Okafor was quiet for a moment. "That's going to land hard on day 1. "Good. It should." She picked up the first file from the stack of 68. The weekend went fast. She organized the office, annotated the remaining curriculum sections, drove back to Ashford on Sunday to pick up the last of what she needed, and stood for a few minutes in her apartment looking at the space of it. The couch, the shelf, the photograph. She'd arranged for a neighbor to check on the place, which felt like a practical and vaguely adult thing to do. She wasn't sure when she'd started doing practical adult things as a reflex rather than a deliberate effort. Somewhere in the last 3 years, probably. She picked up the photograph and put it in her bag. She drove back to Fort Ironwood in the dark, which she preferred. The mountains were invisible at night, but you could feel their mass on either side of the highway, the specific atmospheric weight of elevation, of terrain that didn't care about any individual moving through it. She'd always found that steadying rather than ominous. Things that didn't care were at least honest about it. Her phone rang at 9:47. Falk. She put it on speaker. "I'm driving." "I'll be brief. Petrowal's full deposition was filed this afternoon. With what you gave us and what she gave us, Severin's office has enough to move on all 4 defendants simultaneously. There will be a joint press release from the DCIS and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the morning." A pause. "It's going to mention Hollow Reach. It's going to mention that multiple military personnel were targeted as part of a suppression campaign. It's not going to name you specifically, but that was Severin's call and the right one. But your record will be officially declassified concurrent with the release, which means anyone who looks will find it." She was quiet for a moment. The highway ran straight ahead in her headlights. "That's fine," she said. "Are you sure?" "I've been Ghost Angel in a classified file for 8 years, she said. "If it's time to be something else, that's fine." "There's one more thing." His voice shifted. Not heavier, but more careful. "One of the individuals in Halvard Group, the logistics firm. His name is Dale Merritt. He was the contract liaison embedded with your unit during Hollow Reach under a cover designation." She knew that name. She didn't say so immediately. "He's the one who authorized the equipment configuration. Falk said. The communications array that failed. The one you noted in your original debrief. The highway, the dark mountains, the headlights running straight. We know, Falk said quietly, that the communications failure was not accidental. The array was configured to fail under specific atmospheric conditions, the conditions that existed on that mountain on that day. It was deliberate. A pause. I'm telling you this because you're going to read it in the indictment documents, and I didn't want you to read it cold. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The 22-year-old, the compression, 26 minutes. The communications failure that had meant the evacuation request hadn't gone through until 14 minutes after it was sent. 14 minutes during which 3 people had died waiting for a response that was already on its way, but hadn't arrived because the array had been configured to fail at altitude above 8,000 feet, which was exactly where they had been. She had always known, in the way that field people knew things without being able to prove them, that the failure wasn't random. She had written it in her debrief. The sentence had been redacted. Merritt is cooperating, she said. He's trying to. His lawyer is trying to negotiate a reduced charge in exchange for testimony against Gould. Gould is the contractor executive, the one who authorized the configuration. Merritt says he was following orders. He may be telling the truth. That won't change his charge. No, she said, it won't. She drove in silence for another mile. Thank you for telling me. I'll send you the filing documents in the morning. He hung up. She drove the remaining 20 minutes to Fort Ironwood without the radio, without the phone, with the mountains on either side of the highway and the headlights running straight, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was enormous and complicated, and not something she was going to resolve tonight, and that was all right. She'd learned, slowly and imperfectly, the difference between things that needed to be resolved and things that just needed to be felt. She parked at the base housing unit. She sat in the car for 3 minutes. She went inside and unpacked the photograph and set it on the desk in her temporary quarters, and she looked at it for a while in the light of the desk lamp, and she thought about Della Torres and the 22-year-old and the 14 minutes and the 8,000 feet and the array that had been configured to fail. She thought about 68 recruits arriving Monday morning who didn't know yet what it was going to cost them to do this work, who didn't know yet that the cost was real and nameable and survivable, but only if someone told them the truth about what it was. She was going to tell them the truth. She was going to tell them starting Monday, and she was going to keep telling them until they understood it, and then she was going to hand them back to the world better prepared for it than she had been, which was the only thing she could give them that was actually worth anything. She opened her laptop. She looked at the 68 files. She started with the first one. The recruit's name was Amber Reyes, 23 years old, prior service in logistics, applying for combat medic lateral transfer. Evaluation notes said she was technically strong and interpersonally reserved, which the evaluator had marked as a potential concern. Olivia made a note next to that assessment. Not a concern, a resource. Teach her to use it. She moved to the second file. She was on the 9th file when her laptop pinged with an incoming document, Falk's filing materials, as promised. She opened it. She read the first page, which was a summary document, and the second, which was the evidentiary outline, and then she got to the third page and stopped. A name she hadn't expected. Not in the indictment, not in the contractor chain, in the supporting documentation. Listed as a recipient of communications from Halvard Group in the 6 months preceding the operation. Communications that had included, according to the filing summary, advance notice of the communications array configuration. A name that was currently attached to a hospital administrative position. Not Heller, not Pratton. A name that was attached to the Chief of Medical Operations at Riverside Veterans Medical Center. A position that had existed for 8 years. A position that she had worked under for 3 of them. A position held by a man named Wallace Greer. She read the page 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it, because she needed to be certain she was reading what she was actually reading and not what exhaustion and a long week were constructing for her out of parts that didn't connect. They connected. Walt Greer, the name in the supporting documentation. Communications recipient, 6 months before Hollow Reach. Advance notice of the array configuration, which meant advance notice of the failure, which meant that when the evacuation request went silent for 14 minutes, there was a man in a converted auto repair shop on the east side of Ashford who had known why. She sat with that for a long time. Then she called Falk. He picked up on the first ring this time. She heard him register the hour. It was past 11. And register something else in the single second before she spoke. Page 3 of the supporting documentation, she said. The communications recipients list. A pause. A different kind of pause than his other ones. You saw it. When were you going to tell me? In the morning, with context. His voice was controlled but not dismissive. I didn't want you reading it alone at night without... I'm reading it alone at night. I know. I'm sorry. He meant it. The documentation connects him to Halvard Group as a paid consultant in the 2 years leading up to the operation. The communication containing the array configuration detail was sent to his personal email. We believe he was a secondary contractor, not involved in the operational decisions directly, but a conduit. Someone who moved information between the contractor side and individuals with access to the mission structure. She said nothing. We don't know yet if he understood what the information would be used for, Falk said. That's the honest answer. The configuration detail could have been framed to him as a routine update, or he could have known exactly what it meant. That determination is part of the ongoing investigation. He called you, she said, Friday night after Decker's. He called the office of the Surgeon General. He found me. Yes. He said he was protecting me. He may have believed that. People are capable of... Falk stopped. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about this. He may have genuinely wanted to protect you while also having done something that contributed to what happened on that mountain. Those things can both be true. That's part of what we're trying to establish. She looked at the photograph on the desk. 7 people. Snow on the ridgeline. Della Torres was second from the right. She had her head turned slightly, looking at something off-frame, the way she always looked, like she was already thinking about the next problem. What happens now? Olivia said. He'll be interviewed. His financial records are already being subpoenaed. If the evidence supports a charge, he'll be charged. If it establishes he was deceived about the purpose of the information, he won't. Falk paused. Either way, his name is going to come up in the federal proceedings. Whatever his role was, it won't stay private. She thought about his office, the 3 empty coffee cups, the photograph of a mountain, the 12 years of work with veterans that was real and documentable, and had helped people she could name. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd said, "Ghost Angel," that specific expression she hadn't been able to read, and understood now that what she hadn't been able to read was guilt. All right, she said. Olivia, I'll be reachable tomorrow, she said. I have 68 recruits starting Monday. She hung up and sat at the desk with the filing documents open on her laptop and the photograph in front of her, and a feeling in her chest that wasn't grief exactly. She'd felt grief before and knew its specific weight, but was something adjacent to it. The feeling of a thing you thought you understood rearranging itself into a different shape. She closed the laptop. She went to bed. She slept better than she'd expected to, which told her something about where she actually was. Not past it, but through the worst of the immediate shock, in the territory where the facts were facts, and the only thing left was what you did with them. Monday came clear and cold, and 68 recruits arrived in the main training room at Fort Ironwood at 0700 in the particular formation of people who had been told to be somewhere specific and weren't yet sure what kind of specific it was going to be. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. 23 through 29 mostly. Mixed background, some with field time, some straight from training pipelines, some lateral transfers like Amber Reyes. They had the collective posture of people who were competent in their existing lanes and had arrived here expecting to add a technical specialty to what they already knew. She let them stand there for a moment. She didn't rush the beginning. My name is Olivia Carter, she said. I'm going to be your primary instructor for the next 8 weeks. I have a combat medic background and a civilian ER nursing background, and I have opinions about both of those things that I will share with you in detail over the course of this program. She walked along the front of the room, not pacing, just moving, the way she moved when she was thinking. I want to tell you something before we open a single manual or run a single scenario. I want to tell you about a mission. The room was very quiet. She told them, Not the classified details, the location, the unit designation, the operational specifics that were still restricted, but the shape of it: a mountain, a communications failure, 31 casualties, 15 dead. A 22-year-old medic who had done every procedure correctly and watched his patient die anyway, and had no framework for what that meant or what he was allowed to feel about it. And then herself, not as a legend, not with the call sign or the commendation, just as a person who had been 26 years old and kneeling in mountain rock holding compression on a chest that had stopped responding, and the specific thing that experience had cost her in the years that followed. She told them about the 60%, about the 3 years in the Ashford ER running below her actual capacity, because half of her processing was occupied by something she'd never been given the language or the framework to handle. She didn't make it dramatic, she made it accurate. When she finished, the room was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the polite attention of people waiting for the syllabus to start, but the specific stillness of people who had just heard something that landed in a place they recognized. The technical components of this program are real, and they are assessed, and they matter, she said. If you can't perform the procedures, you can't help anyone. That's not secondary. But the psychological component is not a footnote, and it is not optional, and it carries equal weight in your assessment. Because the best technical medic in any theater is only as functional as their ability to keep working after the first time they lose someone they were trained to save. She stopped at the center of the room. We are going to teach you both. We are going to teach you how to do the work, and we are going to teach you what the work costs and how to carry the cost without it breaking you. She looked at them steadily. Any questions before we start? One hand. A young man in the third row, heavy set, with the kind of face that was more expressive than he probably wanted it to be. Ma'am, the mission you described, did the medic make it? She looked at him. No, she said. He didn't. A beat. That's why we're here, she said. They started. The first week was the hardest, the way first weeks always were. The calibration period, the sorting out of who had what gaps and where the program's existing structure needed to bend. She found 3 recruits who were technically behind the cohort curve and worked with Okafor to build parallel support sessions without pulling them from the main group. She found 2 who were technically ahead and gave them the additional responsibility of peer support and scenario runs, which was both a practical decision and a deliberate one. The people who were most capable needed to learn early that capability was not the end of the obligation but the beginning of it. Amber Reyes was, as expected, technically strong and interpersonally reserved. She was also, Olivia noticed by Wednesday, the one recruit who consistently sat with the struggling members of the cohort during breaks without being asked, not coaching them, not performing mentorship, just being present. She wasn't doing it consciously. She was doing it because it was her instinct. Olivia made a note. Leadership track. Tell her. Not yet. Week 3. The psychological module launched Thursday. She taught it herself, with Okafor running the scenario documentation. It was not a lecture. It was a structured conversation, which was harder to run than a lecture, but produced something a lecture couldn't. Actual disclosure, actual weight-bearing, 68 people discovering together that the thing they'd each been privately bracing for was the same thing. One recruit, a woman named Serena Valls, 24, prior logistics, cried during the second hour. Not quietly, either. She started to apologize, and Olivia stopped her. Don't apologize, she said. That response is appropriate. It's accurate. The work you're training for is hard enough to cry about. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't done it yet. Valls wiped her face. A few people in the room shifted, a few more relaxed. Moving on, Olivia said. The Greer situation resolved on a Friday, 3 weeks into the program. Falk called at noon and she stepped out of the simulation bay to take it. The subpoena came back, he said. The financial records. Greer received 2 payments from a Halvard Group subsidiary in 2016 and 2017 totaling $64,000. Classified in his personal records as consulting fees for Veteran Services Program development. A pause. The communication containing the array configuration detail was sent to him by a Halvard Group logistics manager named Stein, who is cooperating. Stein's testimony establishes that Greer was told the communication was a routine operational update, equipment specs for a support contract. He was not told it was a communications array. He was not told it would be deployed in a classified theater. She was standing in the hallway outside the simulation bay, one hand on the wall. So he didn't know what he was passing on. But that's Stein's account. Greer's own statement, he agreed to be interviewed voluntarily, is consistent with that. He took the payment, he passed the communication, he didn't ask enough questions. Falk paused. Whether that constitutes criminal liability is being determined. But Severin's current position is that his exposure is civil rather than criminal, negligence rather than intent. She thought about him in his office, the empty coffee cups, the 12 years of work that was genuine. He's going to have to disclose it, she said, to the veterans he works with, to the board of his organization. Yes, that process has already started. He self-reported to his board this week. She absorbed that. A man who had done real work for real people for 12 years and had also made choices in a gray area that had turned out to have darker consequences than he'd understood at the time, and was now going to live with both of those things being true simultaneously. That was not a clean story. It was not the story she would have written if she'd been writing it. It was the actual story, which was almost never clean. He asked me to tell you something, Falk said. If you were willing to hear it. What? He said, tell her I knew something was wrong after the mission. I didn't know what I'd been part of, but I knew something was wrong, and I didn't do enough about it. I found her 3 years later because I thought if she was all right, that meant what I'd done hadn't mattered. I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry. She stood in the hallway for a long moment. It was not a sufficient apology. It was also, she recognized, a genuine one, the kind that didn't ask for anything back, that didn't frame itself as a request for absolution, just an accounting of what had happened, from the person who needed to give it. Okay, she said. Is that a message to pass back? No, she said. It's just okay. She went back into the simulation bay. The joint press release from the DCIS and the U.S. Attorney's Office ran on a Tuesday morning and got significant coverage, which she'd expected. The story had the elements that travel: classified military operation, contractor fraud, deliberate sabotage, 4-year suppression campaign, federal indictments. The coverage was largely accurate, which was not always guaranteed. Her name appeared in 2 of the major outlets, not prominently, but accurately. Former combat medic. Classified designation. Targeted as part of the suppression campaign. Currently leading a military training program at Fort Ironwood, Colorado. She read the pieces once, at 6 a.m., before the cohort arrived, and then put her phone away. Deb Frazier texted at 6:47. Saw the news, not surprised. Call me when you surface. Maddox sent an email, characteristically brief. Well done. See you at week 8. Marcus Doyle sent a text that said, I owe you more than an apology. I know that now. Thank you for not writing me off. She thought about that one for a moment, then texted back, don't waste it. Be better to the people who do the work nobody sees. She got a thumbs up in return, which was exactly the right level of response. The one she didn't expect came Wednesday afternoon. A voicemail from a number she didn't recognize, Virginia area code, left while she was running the afternoon scenario block. The voice was Petra Walls. I don't know if you remember me, Wall said, which was an odd way to start given that she'd called Olivia's personal cell at 11 p.m. 3 weeks ago. We weren't in the same unit. I was signals support, 2 ridges over. I heard your call sign on the comms the night of the main engagement. I've heard it in my head most nights since. A pause. And in the pause, Olivia could hear something that wasn't quite collected. A person holding themselves together for the duration of a voicemail in a way that took effort. I just wanted you to know that what you did, the deposition, the record, it didn't just matter for the case. It mattered for the people who've been carrying this without any frame to put it in. You gave the story a shape. You gave it an ending. Another pause. That's it. That's what I wanted to say. You don't have to call back. She listened to it twice. She didn't call back, not because she didn't want to, but because Wall had said what she needed to say, and asking for more would have been taking something. She saved the voicemail. She went back to the cohort. Ort. Week 5 brought the first real crisis of the program. A recruit named Obi Makinde, 25, technically one of the strongest in the cohort, locked up in a scenario run. Not a minor hesitation, a full freeze. The scenario was a multi-casualty simulation, 2 critical patients, resource constraint, decision required inside 90 seconds. He stood in the middle of it and stopped, and the simulation ran for 40 seconds past the decision window before Okafor called the pause. She pulled him after. They sat in the instructor's office with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee, and she did not begin with what went wrong. She asked him what he'd seen in those 40 seconds. He looked at the desk for a moment. "Both of them," he said finally. "Both patients. I ran the triage. I knew which one had better odds. I knew what the protocol said." He stopped. "And I thought about what it was going to feel like to walk away from the other one. And I just stopped." "Good," she said. He looked up. "Ma'am?" "That's the right problem to be having," she said. "The wrong problem would be not feeling it at all. The training failure would be freezing because you'd never been prepared for that feeling to exist. We've been preparing you for 3 weeks." She looked at him. "Which means what happened today isn't the freeze itself. It's the first time the preparation met the reality. It's going to feel terrible, and then it's going to feel different. Not easy. Different." He was quiet for a moment. "What if it happens in the field?" "It might," she said. "Once. Maybe twice. And then it won't, because you'll have the memory of having gotten through it. And memory is the only thing that actually works in those moments. Not protocol. Memory." She picked up her coffee. "We run the scenario again Thursday. Same parameters. You lead." He looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." He led on Thursday. He made the call in 63 seconds. It wasn't pretty. His hands shook on the equipment, and he swore under his breath at the 50-second mark. But he made it, and he made the right one. And when the simulation ended, he stood there for a moment with his head down, just breathing. She didn't say anything. She caught Okafor's eye across the room, and Okafor gave her the specific look of one instructor to another that meant, yeah, that was it. Week 8 arrived the way the end of intensive things arrived. Suddenly, after what had felt like an impossibly slow middle. The final assessments ran across 3 days, and 63 of the 68 recruits cleared full certification. 4 cleared conditional certification with a structured follow-up requirement, which was honest and appropriate and not a failure of the program, but a feature of it. The willingness to say not yet rather than pass someone who wasn't ready, which the old curriculum had not consistently done. One recruit withdrew voluntarily in week 6, which was also not a failure. He'd come into the program knowing he wanted a different lane and had stayed long enough to be sure. She'd had a conversation with him that had been hard and had also been right, and he'd left with a clearer picture of what he was actually built for, which was worth something. The certification ceremony was small. Maddox came, as promised. Okafor spoke. Olivia did not give a prepared speech. She said what was true, that this cohort had done something harder than pass a technical assessment. They'd done it honestly, which was the only way it counted, and they were going back to their units carrying something that was difficult to name, but that every person who had survived this kind of work would recognize immediately when they encountered it. "You know what it costs," she said. "You know how to carry it. Those are the 2 things I needed to give you. Everything else is yours." Amber Reyes, in the front row, had the specific expression of someone who was holding something in and was almost managing it. Olivia had told her 2 weeks earlier, week 3, as planned, that she was a natural leader and that leadership was not the same as being the most technically proficient, and that the instinct she had toward the struggling members of the cohort was not softness, but a specific and rare quality that she should name and keep and not let anyone train out of her. Reyes had sat with that for a day, and then come back and said, without preamble, "How do I get better at it?" Which was exactly the right question. After the ceremony, Maddox found her outside the building. "The program is being written into permanent curriculum," he said. "DoD signed off this morning. Okafor will run subsequent cohorts with your consultation on the psychological component." He paused. "Which means your part in this is not going to be invisible." "I know." "Are you all right with that?" She looked at the mountains. November had given way to something colder, and the ridgelines had snow on them now. Real snow, settled in for the season. She thought about a different mountain, a different ridgeline, a photograph she'd kept behind a filing cabinet for 3 years because looking at it had been too much and not looking at it had been a lie. "I'm all right with it," she said. He nodded. He didn't push. He never pushed. "The commendation ceremony," he said. "The board has approved a formal recognition. Public, on record. I want to know your preference on timing." She thought about it. "Spring," she said, "after the second cohort starts. I don't want it to be the story before the program has a chance to be the story." "Done." She looked at him. "I'm going to try to find the other 2 survivors from the photograph." "I know. I had them located last year. I was waiting for your word." He reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper. 2 names, 2 cities, 2 sets of contact information. "Whenever you're ready." She held the paper. She didn't open it yet. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the specific way she only meant things when they came from the part of her that didn't have a clinical distance from them. He understood the difference. He inclined his head slightly and left. She stood outside in the cold with the paper in her hand. She drove back to Ashford that evening. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The neighbor had checked on it twice, and the plants she'd started keeping in the last year were still alive, which she considered a minor personal success. She set her bag down and walked through the space, kitchen, hallway, living room, and stood in front of the shelf. The photograph had been on the shelf for 6 weeks. It had a specific quality now that it hadn't had when it was behind the filing cabinet. It was part of the room, part of the ordinary visual landscape of her life. She'd looked at it so many times in the past weeks that she'd stopped bracing before she looked. She sat on the couch. She opened the paper Maddox had given her, 2 names. She knew both of them. Of course she did. She'd served with them in the closest possible proximity, and then spent 3 years in a city 40 minutes from a mountain range that looked like the one in the photograph, telling herself that not tracking them was self-preservation. It was. It was also the thing that had kept her at 60%. She picked up her phone. She looked at the first name and the number beside it. She dialed. It rang 4 times. She was prepared for voicemail. "Yeah." A man's voice, rough-edged with something that was either sleep or the specific hoarseness of a voice that had been put through a long time. "Who's this?" "Raphael," she said. "It's Olivia Carter." A silence. Long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. "Olivia." His voice changed completely. Not softer, fuller. Like a room that had been missing something getting it back. I didn't know if you were—" "I know," she said. "I should have called sooner." "I should have called sooner," he said. "I had your number for 2 years. I wrote the email 4 times." "Me too." She looked at the photograph. "We need to talk. About the investigation, about Hollow Reach, about what happened to the operational record and what's happening now." She paused. "But that's not why I'm calling tonight." "Why are you calling tonight?" "Because it's been 3 years and I've been carrying this like it was only mine, and it wasn't only mine." She stopped. "And because I'm better now than I was, and I wanted you to know that, in case it matters." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but with something underneath it that wasn't quite. "It matters," he said. "It matters a lot." They talked for 2 hours, not about the mission, about everything around it, everything since, the shape of the years that had followed, the ways they'd each built something workable out of the wreckage and the ways they hadn't. He was in Portland. He'd been working at a veterans rehabilitation clinic for 18 months. He had a dog named after a mountain pass in a country that didn't officially exist in any public record. He laughed twice, which she hadn't been sure she'd ever hear again, and the second time she laughed too, and it felt like a door opening in a room that had been shut so long it had started to seem like a wall. She called the second number the next morning. That conversation was shorter, 40 minutes, and harder in different ways because the woman on the other end was further into the difficulty and less sure of the workable shape, and Olivia didn't try to fix it. She listened and said what was honest and gave her Okafor's contact information and the name of a program at Fort Ironwood that had a module specifically designed for what she was describing. "Is it actually useful?" The woman. Her name was Jonah Priestley. and she'd been carrying the call sign Rattler for reasons that were a long story, I'd said. Or is it the kind of thing that sounds useful in a brochure? I built it, Olivia said. So I'm biased. But I built it out of every mistake I made in the 3 years I spent not dealing with this, so it's at least practical. A long pause. Okay, Priestley said. I'll look at it. That's all I'm asking. She hung up and sat at her kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window above the sink. The city was ordinary outside. A Tuesday in Ashford, Colorado, the kind of Tuesday that had no specific weight. A delivery truck on the street below. The sound of a neighbor's door. The particular quality of ordinary mornings that she'd spent 3 years collecting like they were proof of something, and maybe they were. The formal commendation ceremony happened in April, on a Thursday, at Fort Ironwood. She'd requested small. What she got was not exactly small. Maddox had interpreted small as not a stadium, which was accurate but left a significant range. There were maybe 100 people in the room, which included the second cohort of Fort Ironwood recruits, several members of the hospital staff from Riverside who had made the drive up, Deb Frazier in the front row wearing an expression that was both controlled and comprehensively proud, and Raphael, who had flown in from Portland and was standing against the back wall because he said he preferred to have the exit visible, which she understood completely. Maddox read the commendation aloud. She listened to it with the specific discipline of a person who had agreed to hear this in public and was going to do it without looking at the floor. It named the mission, the classified designation, declassified now and on public record, the actions under fire, the number of casualties treated, the structural contributions to the operational record that had formed the evidentiary basis for the federal proceedings. And then a line she hadn't known was going to be in it. Specialist Carter remained, under extraordinary personal cost, a faithful witness to the truth of what happened, not for recognition, not for vindication, but because the people who did not come home deserved a complete record. She stood in the front of the room and heard those words and was not, in fact, able to maintain the clinical distance she'd intended to maintain. She didn't cry. But it was a near thing, and she stopped trying to prevent the near thing, which was its own kind of progress. After, Deb found her in the corridor. "You should have told me," Deb said. "I know. 3 years. I could have—" "You did," Olivia said. "You supported the work. You pushed back against the inquiry. You showed up. That was what was needed." She looked at Deb. "The rest of it wasn't something you could have carried for me." Deb looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had enough experience to know when an argument was actually not an argument but a genuine accounting. "All right," she said, "but you're coming back to my ER. 6 weeks. Second cohort finishes in June. I'll have your locker cleared by July 1st. She almost said you didn't need to do that. And then she didn't. Because the truth was, she wanted that. She wanted to come back to the floor that she knew, and the work that she was good at, and the ordinary Tuesday rhythm of a job that asked everything of her in the best possible way. Fort Ironwood was not replacing that. It was expanding what it meant to be someone who could do both. She found Raphael at the reception afterward. He looked better than she'd expected, and also exactly as she'd expected. Thinner than he'd been, with more gray in his hair than a 33-year-old should have, and with the specific quality of someone who was functional and knew it was costing them something to stay that way, but was paying it anyway because the alternative was worse. "How are you doing?" she said, not as a question. "Honestly, 65%, he said, "up from 50. "That's not nothing." "No." He looked at the room, the recruits, the ceremony setup, the general organized purposefulness of Fort Ironwood going about its day. "You built something here." Okafor built most of it. "You built the part that matters," he said, "the part that tells them what it costs." He looked at her. Della would have said it was about time someone wrote that down. She felt the name land the way it always landed. Not sharp anymore, but present, real. The kind of hurt that was actually the other side of something that had been worth having. "Yeah," she said. She would have. They stood there for a moment in the way that people stood who had been through something that couldn't be fully articulated in any conversation and had stopped trying to articulate it and had started just standing next to each other instead, which was its own kind of language. 4 months after the commendation, the federal trial of Terrence Gould and the 3 co-defendants began in a federal courthouse in Denver. She was not required to testify in person. Her deposition and formal statement were entered into evidence directly, but she drove down on the 3rd day and sat in the public gallery for 2 hours, not as a participant, but as a witness to the process working the way it was supposed to work, which was not quickly and not cleanly and not without the particular ugliness of watching people try to minimize what they had done, but which was moving nonetheless in the direction it needed to move. Gould's defense argued equipment failure. It argued contractor error. It argued that the communications array configuration had been a logistics decision with no knowledge of operational deployment. Severin dismantled each argument with the specific efficiency of someone who had been building the case for 18 months and knew exactly where it held and where the defense would try to push. She watched it for 2 hours and then left before she'd planned to, because 2 hours was enough. She'd read the verdict when it came. It came 6 weeks later. All 4 defendants, guilty on the primary charges. Sentencing was scheduled for November. She read the notification on her phone while she was on shift at Riverside. She'd been back on the ER floor for 6 weeks by then, back in the rhythm of it, back in the room where she knew how to be most useful. She read it, set her phone in her pocket, and went back to the patient she'd been with, who was a 60-year-old veteran with a chest complaint that turned out to be costochondritis rather than cardiac, which was good news she was able to deliver with conviction because she'd already run the differentials. She delivered it. He thanked her. She moved on. That was the job. That had always been the job. The next patient, the next problem, the next decision inside whatever window of time was available. She'd spent a long time thinking the job was something she'd retreated into because it was easier than everything else. She understood now that the job was the thing itself. It wasn't retreat. It was where she actually lived. On the last day of October, she drove up to Fort Ironwood for the launch of the 3rd cohort. She wasn't running the 3rd cohort. Okafor had it, with a junior instructor she'd trained who was good and would get better. But Maddox had asked her to come for the first day to speak to the new recruits, and she'd said yes because it was the right thing to say yes to, and because she'd found, in the months since the program launched, that she wanted to keep doing it, not as the primary weight-bearing structure of her professional life, but as something that ran alongside the ER work, that kept her connected to the particular purpose that the 8 weeks at Fort Ironwood had clarified for her. She stood in front of the new cohort, 59 this time, a smaller group, and she told them the same story she'd told the first cohort, the mountain, the 22-year-old, the 26 minutes. And then she told them something she hadn't told the first group. I spent 3 years after that mission operating below what I actually was, she said. Not because I was broken. I wasn't. But because nobody had told me it was okay to acknowledge what the work cost. And so I stored it somewhere I thought wouldn't affect my function, and I was wrong about that. She looked at them. What I know now, that I didn't know then, is that the cost doesn't go away if you don't look at it. It just changes shape. It becomes the 60% instead of the whole. It becomes the decisions you make slower than you should, the moments you pull back when you should be fully there. She paused. You are going to do this work, and it is going to matter, and it is going to cost you something real. The people in this room, she gestured toward Okafor, toward the junior instructor, toward the support staff. They are here to make sure that cost doesn't become a debt you can't pay. But we can only do that if you let us. And you can only let us if you understand before we start that needing support is not a failure of strength. It is actually the most tactically sound decision you will make in this entire program. She looked at the 59 faces in front of her. Some of them were nodding. Some were holding very still. All right, she said. Let's get to work. She drove back to Ashford in the early evening, the mountains sharp against a sky that had gone the specific orange-violet of high-altitude sunset. And she drove without the radio and without thinking too hard about anything in particular, which was a thing she'd been slowly learning to do, to let the in-between spaces be in between instead of filling them with the inventory of everything that still needed attention. Not everything that was hard had become easy. The photograph on the shelf still had a weight to it on certain mornings. She still ran hard cases in her head after long shifts. She still sometimes woke at 2 a.m. with the muscle memory of compression, hands pressing down, counting, not stopping. She didn't think that would go away entirely, and she'd stopped expecting it to. But the 60% was 80 now and rising. Not because the past had changed, because she'd stopped treating it as something that needed to be hidden from the present. She pulled into her parking spot and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. 3 years of ordinary life, built carefully and deliberately, and it was still here. The apartment, the floor, the rhythm of the city. It hadn't been replaced by everything that had happened. It had been expanded by it. The ghost had a name now, and the name was on public record, and the people who had tried to bury what happened on that mountain were going to spend the next several years in federal court, and 63 medics were already out in the world carrying something they hadn't had before she built it for them. That was the shape of it. Incomplete in places, imperfect at the edges, with the specific texture of things that are real rather than things that are imagined. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She made dinner, something that actually required effort this time, because she'd been cooking real food again for a few months and was mildly pleased with herself about it, and she ate it at the kitchen table. And afterwards she sat on the couch and looked at the photograph on the shelf in the ordinary evening light of her ordinary apartment in a city that had never asked who she was before she came here and had come to know her anyway. 7 people. Snow on the ridgeline. She looked at it without bracing. That was the thing nobody told you about the work of carrying something heavy for a long time. Not the dramatic part, not the moment of revelation or vindication, but this, the ordinary Tuesday evening when you realize you're sitting in your own living room without the weight pressing down. And it's not because the weight is gone, but because you've finally stopped fighting the carrying of it, and the difference between those two things is everything. The ones who didn't make it back had deserved the truth. She'd given them that. The ones still out there, still working, still carrying their own versions of the mountain. They deserved to know what it cost and that the cost was survivable. She was giving them that too. Ghost Angel. Not a forgotten legend, not a cautionary tale, not even a hero in the way that word usually got used, which was imprecise and too clean and left out all the parts that actually mattered. Just a person who had been through something real and had decided, not once, but over and over on 100 ordinary mornings, to let it mean something. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took a while to know it,